Okay, in this last part here, I want to talk about some other minor distortions of memory. These are just some other laboratory phenomena which are kind of interesting, which reinforce the concept that indeed our memories are malleable and subject to distortions. So the first one begins with this thing called imagination inflation. We've actually kind of talked about a version of it, but what Marianne Gary and her colleagues did is they would bring people into the lab and they would rate the likelihood that childhood events actually happened. Like, how likely was it that you got stuck in a tree, finding a $10 bill, getting lost in a mall, etc. They come back some point later, like usually prototypically like a week later, and they would tell them, "Hey, yeah, we lost your surveys." Or I'm sorry, "Hey, what we want you to do is imagine that half of some of these events actually happened." So they might imagine that they found a $10 bill as a kid. Then it's time three. They tell them, "Hey, we lost your questionnaire. Can you fill it out again?" And then they look at how the ratings changed after they imagined items. And what happens is, if for imagined items, you're much more likely to think that those events actually happened. So if you imagine finding a $10 bill, your rating goes up from time one to time two. Now the explanations for this, so that's why it's called imagination inflation, because your rating gets inflated with imagination, right? So this is a lot like what we've seen before. We talked about this with actions in the laboratory. So if you imagine performing actions in the laboratory, you're more likely to think that you've actually done them. So it's explained as a source monitoring failure. That is, you're having trouble determining what you actually just read about and what you actually imagine, right? Where you confuse those two sources. Another explanation is fluency. Again, ease of processing. So if you repeatedly imagine something, that comes to mind a lot easier, and you mistake that ease of processing for being true, and you think it's actually happened to you. A friend of mine was interested, so Josh Landau was interested in this concept, and he wanted to see would this translate to other kinds of tasks. So he had his subjects come in and imagining lifting a heavy object like a refrigerator, and he just asked them, how much weight could you lift? And it turns out that the control that had no imagination session, they estimated about 88 pounds. But if you imagine lifting a heavy object, 113 pounds. So your estimates go up with imagination as well. And he interpreted this as, again, a memory error from imagination. Now, he was criticized for, like, well, how do you know that this imagination exercise didn't increase people's ability to lift heavy weights, which seems like a ridiculous concept, but nevertheless, we tested it. So what we did, we didn't have them lift heavy objects. We imagined them making a basketball free throw. And we then said, after they did the imagination exercise, we then handed them a basketball. We said, okay, now shoot. And we measured how many they could make out of 10. So in the control group with no imagination, they made about 44%. The imagination group increased their imaginings, and they thought they could make 57%. So we saw that same effect, right? So imagination increases your memories or your estimates of your own performance. But when they actually shot, there was no statistical difference here. Maybe a small little increase, but no statistical significant difference here. So it increases your memory or your estimates of your performance, but not actual performance. Now, again, think about this as a memory error. What are you using if you're estimating your performance? You're using your memory. You're drawing on your memory, and if you just imagined making a bunch of shots, then you're going to be more overconfident and sort of think that you are better at that task than you are. So what this shows is that you have this ability to distort your own estimates of your performance on individual tasks from memory. Now, another minor distortion of memory is something called the revelation effect. And essentially what happens with this is you study a list of words and you're going to complete a recognition test, so a typical old new recognition test. But half of the words on this test are revealed. What does that mean? Well, it's been done many different ways, but they could be revealed as like one letter at a time. So like down here, you can sort of see that the word gets slowly revealed with each step. And then you're going to judge rational. Was that an old word or a new word? Or it could be rotated, right? It could be an anagram where you sort of switched. Could be revealed like one letter at a time. So here you see down here one letter at a time. or they could be rotated. They could be as an anagram where they're where individual letters are switched. It's been done many different ways, right? The point here is that revealing them leads to more old responses, right? So more old responses, and this is true for both old and new items for revealed items. Now the explanation for this, typically there's two explanations for it or multiple causes for it. And there's really two types of tasks. The ones that we were just talking about, those were what we call related tasks. That is, the study word itself is changed. So it's rotated or shown one letter at a time. There are some other tasks where you can do an unrelated task, like if you complete a math problem right before you make the recognition judgment. It also produces a revelation effect, but it's done in a different task. And usually the explanation is from two different kinds of ways. Or these, so in other words, the related tasks, that when the study word is changed, the revelation actually decreases fluency. So think about if you're revealing it one letter at a time, you don't know what that word is. At first, it takes a long time before the word is finally revealed to you, and that's going to hurt fluency, hurt the ease of processing. So when that happens, when it decreases fluency, participants get more liberal and they have more old judgments in general, right? So figure 1b is sort of showing you what would happen when you decrease the fluency from revealing an item. The unrelated tasks, though, they do the opposite. The revelation in this case increases fluency. Why? Because doing a math problem is harder than reading a word. Reading a word is relatively easier by comparison. So that makes it seem a lot more fluent, easier to process. And what happens in this case is both the new and the old item distributions get shifted to the right, and that increases hits and false alarms. Right? So two different explanations for the same phenomena. Now, this last distortion of memory is something called the false fame effect, and this is by Jacoby and colleagues. And what they had people do is read a list of non-famous names, and they were told they were non-famous. Then they later viewed a mixed list, some famous, some non-famous names. And what happened, though, maybe unbeknownst to the subjects, is that some of these non-famous names were then repeated from the first phase. Subjects were simply asked to identify who's famous on this list. As you might imagine, many of the old non-famous names were identified as famous, right? Claiming to have been fame, right? False fame. That's the idea behind this. So what's happening here is that generally fluency, right? So you see this non-famous name in the original phase, and then you're seeing them again mixed in with famous names. And because they're easier to process, because you just saw them not too long ago, you're misinterpreting this fluency as evidence that you know this person. They're famous, right? So you can create, again, false fame is sort of like a false memory for someone who should be known, right? So this is where I usually sort of wrap up. We've talked about distortions of memory, and I don't want you to walk away thinking, our memory is always inaccurate. Yeah, we can show lots of distortions of memory, and we study it to sort of understand how memory works. But remember, we remember the gist pretty well, but it's the details that get distorted. You're not going to change the core details of what happened in an autobiographical memory, but you might change like what shirt you're wearing or who was there, those kinds of things. So watch out for those distortions in your own memory. What you should look for, like if you're a juror in a court case or if you're a witness, imagination, right? That can distort memories. Pushing to retrieve small details, that can lead to inaccurate memory, right? Rely on external aids whenever possible. So make notes if you're involved. Limit contact and discussion of the events with others, because discussing the events with other people can contaminate your own memory. So if you're talking about eyewitness memory, treat your eyewitness memory as evidence and collect it without contamination to the best that you can. The other thing I think you should do is recognize that you could have false memories and try not to trust it for these tiny little details, and look for other evidence of it, and understand that it can happen, it will happen, and it does happen, but try to guard against that. All right, we have one more lecture, and that's going to be lecture 15, and that will do it for the class.